Vinland Saga looks like a story built from legend. A child survives the death of his father, grows up among the killers responsible, and eventually sails toward a land beyond the known world. But the most surprising part is that the destination was real, the voyage happened, and many of the people surrounding Thorfinn actually lived. Tonight, we are going to separate history from fiction and discover the true story hiding inside Vinland Saga. Some of its wildest events are supported by contemporary records. Others come from sagas written centuries later, and a few of its most believable characters never existed at all. To understand where the truth begins, we first have to forget the modern picture of a Viking. In the early 11th century, nobody woke up, put on a horned helmet, and described himself as a member of one united Viking people. The inhabitants of Scandinavia belonged to different families, districts, kingdoms, and trading networks. Going Viking was closer to describing an activity or expedition than naming an ethnicity. A man could spend one season raiding abroad and the next farming at home. This is one of the first things Vinland Saga gets right. Its world is not populated by warriors alone. Behind every army are farmers producing food, smiths shaping iron, merchants moving silver, sailors repairing ships, enslaved people performing forced labor, and families trying to survive decisions made by distant kings. Violence receives the most attention because violence leaves dramatic stories, but the Viking Age was also an age of travel, settlement, commerce, law, and slow political change. The usual beginning of the Viking Age is placed in the late 8th century, when raiders attacked religious communities such as Lindisfarne in 793. The date is useful, but Scandinavian travel did not suddenly begin in that year. Northern Europeans had sailed, traded, migrated, and fought for generations. What changed was the scale. Improvements in ships and organization allowed crews to cross open water, move quickly along coasts and rivers, and appear where defenders did not expect them. The longship became the most recognizable tool of that expansion. It was shallow enough to approach beaches and enter rivers, flexible enough to survive rough seas, and light enough in some circumstances to be dragged or carried around obstacles. Yet not every Norse ship was a narrow warship. Broader cargo vessels carried animals, timber, food, household goods, and families. The settlement of Iceland, Greenland, and eventually Vinland depended less on a heroic charge from a longship than on the slower work of transporting everything a community required to live. Vinland Saga exaggerates individual strength because it is a dramatic story. Thorkell hurls logs, Thor leaps between ships, and Thorfinn moves with almost impossible speed. Real combat was more crowded, confused, and frightening. A warrior who stood alone against dozens of enemies would normally be surrounded and killed. Shields, discipline, formation, terrain, and the loyalty of the men beside you mattered more than superhuman technique. But the series captures the emotional reality of that world unusually well. Reputation could determine whether others followed you. A famous commander might prevent a fight simply because the opposing side believed the stories told about him. Honor, fear, generosity, vengeance, and family obligation were political forces. The historical Thorfinn lived inside this world, but he did not begin where the fictional Thorfinn begins. Makoto Yukimura's protagonist is born in Iceland to Thors and Helga. His father is a legendary former warrior hiding from the Jomsvikings. After Thors is killed, the boy spends years following Askeladd, fighting in England and living entirely for revenge. Almost all of that childhood is fictional. The real Thorfinn is usually known as Thorfinn Karlsefni. Karlsefni was probably a nickname or title. It can be interpreted in ways suggesting a promising man, a person of good material, or someone with the qualities expected of a capable man. He appears in the two main medieval narratives of Norse travel to North America, the Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Eric the Red. These works disagree about many details, but both place a man named Thorfinn at the center of an attempt to establish a community in Vinland. According to the saga tradition, Thorfinn was not an orphaned killer or an enslaved farm laborer. He was an Icelandic merchant and ship captain from a respected family. The Saga of the Greenlanders describes him as wealthy. His ancestry connected him to prominent Icelandic settlers, exactly the kind of lineage medieval saga writers enjoyed recording. This does not prove every branch of the family tree, but it tells us how later Icelanders remembered him, not as a damaged boy trying to escape war, but as an established adult with ships, resources, and social standing. That difference changes the meaning of the Vinland expedition. In the manga, Thorfinn must construct his dream out of suffering. He imagines a distant land without war or slavery because the world he knows has shown him what violence does. The historical Karlsefni probably sailed west for a more practical mixture of opportunity, trade, prestige, and settlement. He may have hoped to obtain valuable timber, furs, food, and new land. Greenland had severe limits, especially when it came to good building wood. A fertile coast with forests was not simply a beautiful discovery, it was an economic resource. There is no contemporary diary written by Karlsefni. No letter survives in which he explains his motives. The sources that describe him were written down long after the voyages, drawing on oral memory, family tradition, literary convention, and the interests of later writers. This distinction will matter throughout our story. Historical does not mean perfectly documented. A person can be real while the stories attached to that person remain uncertain. The sagas were never modern news reports. They were carefully shaped narratives. Their writers selected scenes, speeches, genealogies, prophecies, and conflicts to make sense of the past. They also wrote for audiences who already knew the descendants of the people in the story. When a saga emphasizes that a famous bishop descended from Karlsefni and Gudrid, it may be preserving family history, but it may also be polishing that family's reputation. Even so, the central claim once sounded almost too extraordinary to accept. Around the year 1000, Norse sailors crossed from Greenland to North America. Archaeology eventually confirmed that this part was true. That confirmation makes the uncertainty more fascinating, not less. The sagas can preserve a real voyage while changing its order, its leadership, its conversations, and its heroes. Before following Karlsefni across the Atlantic, however, we need to understand the fictional father who gives Vinland Saga its moral center. Thor's Snorresson, known as the Troll of Jom, is not found in the medieval record. There is no reliable source describing a Jomsviking champion who deserted, settled in Iceland, fathered the historical Karlsefni, and died in an ambush arranged by Floki. Thor's was created for the story. His name and circumstances still feel historically plausible. Thor's is a common kind of Old Norse name, built from the name of the god Thor. Iceland was settled largely by people of Norse origin, along with individuals whose ancestry and connections extended through the British Isles. A man with a violent past could leave Scandinavia, settle on a farm, marry, and attempt to begin again. Feuds, exile, and migration appear repeatedly in Icelandic literature. Yukimura therefore gives Thorfinn a fictional father who seems as if he might have stepped out of a saga. The purpose of Thor's is not to fill a gap in Karlsefni's genealogy. It is to give the story a moral question. What is a true warrior? In a society that rewards strength, can strength be measured by the ability to refuse violence? The famous idea that no one is truly your enemy is a modern philosophical foundation placed inside a medieval setting. It should not be treated as a quotation from a historical Thors because that Thors never lived, but the tension it expresses was not alien to the age. Medieval Scandinavians were not trapped in a culture that understood only killing. They had laws, assemblies, settlements, compensation systems, arbitration, marriage alliances, and religious teachings. Iceland's Althing became one of the most famous assemblies of the Norse world. Disputes could end through payment or judgment instead of bloodshed. Christianity, which was spreading rapidly during Thorfinn's lifetime, emphasized mercy and peace even while Christian kings continued to wage war. The contradiction between moral teaching and political violence was as visible then as it is now. The difficulty was that law depended on power. Iceland had no king and no modern police force. A judgment still had to be enforced by people with allies. Compensation only worked if both sides accepted the settlement or feared the consequences of refusing it. Honor could prevent violence by establishing boundaries, but it could also prolong a feud when neither family wished to appear weak. Thors therefore represents something rarer than simple pacifism. He understands the violent code around him and possesses the status to succeed within it, yet consciously rejects its highest rewards. His ability to defeat opponents without killing them is heightened fiction, but it dramatizes an important truth. Refusing violence is easiest for someone who has never been threatened and hardest for someone whose identity was built around war. The series also makes Iceland appear like a quiet edge of the world, distant from kings and armies. That is partly accurate. Iceland had no permanent army and was geographically removed from the struggle for England. Its population lived mostly on scattered farms rather than inside large towns. Livestock, hay, fishing, seasonal work, and access to land shaped daily life. Winter isolation could make a neighboring household more important than a distant ruler. But Iceland was never disconnected. Ships brought merchants, timber, luxury goods, news, priests, and travelers. Icelanders served foreign kings, traded abroad, visited Norway, joined expeditions, and maintained family connections across the North Atlantic. The island was remote, not sealed. The settlement itself was comparatively young. Norse colonization began in the late 9th century. By the time the real Karlsefni was born, stories about the first settlers were still close enough to shape family identity. Land ownership and ancestry mattered. To know who had first claimed a valley was to know why a later family believed it belonged there. The Iceland scene in Vinland Saga also looks almost treeless, and that reflects a long environmental transformation. When settlers arrived, Iceland possessed more woodland than it does today, though nothing like the forests of mainland Scandinavia. Cutting, grazing, erosion, and a difficult climate reduced woodland over time. Timber became valuable. This helps explain why the wooded coasts west of Greenland attracted attention. In the North Atlantic, a forest could be as strategically important as a silver mine. Thorfinn's village in the series knows Leif Erikson as an old traveler who tells children about a warm and peaceful Vinland. The real connection between Karlsefni and Leif is one of the strongest links between the manga and saga tradition. Leif Erikson was probably a historical person, though his biography is surrounded by competing narratives. He was the son of Erik the Red, the famous settler associated with the Norse colony in Greenland. Erik's story begins with exile. Saga tradition says his father left Norway because of killings, and Erik later became involved in violence in Iceland. After being outlawed, Erik explored land to the west. He then returned and promoted settlement there. The name Greenland is presented as deliberate persuasion. People would be more willing to go if the place had an attractive name. Whether Eric personally invented the earliest piece of northern advertising cannot be proven, but Norse settlements were established in southwestern Greenland near the end of the 10th century. These communities survived for centuries. They raised livestock, hunted, traded walrus ivory and other products, built churches, and maintained contact with Iceland and Europe. Greenland was not merely a temporary camp at the edge of a glacier. It became the home of generations. Its name is less absurd than modern viewers sometimes assume. The settlements lay in fjords where grass could grow during the brief summer. The climate around the time of settlement supported farming in carefully chosen areas, though life remained demanding. Greenland was never an endless green plain, but neither was every inhabited valley buried permanently beneath ice. Leif grew up in this Atlantic-facing community. The sagas disagree about how he discovered Vinland. In the saga of the Greenlanders, another sailor named Bjarni Herjolfsson is blown off course while traveling toward Greenland. He sees unfamiliar lands to the west but does not go ashore. Leif later purchases Bjarni's ship and deliberately retraces the route. In the saga of Eric the Red, Leif himself is blown off course and encounters the western land. This disagreement is revealing. Medieval writers knew a western voyage had occurred, but they did not preserve one universally accepted sequence. The person who first saw the coast, the person who first stepped ashore, and the person who led the most important expedition may have been different people. Later memory naturally gathered achievements around a famous name. Leif's nickname, the Lucky, also appears in the tradition. His good fortune was not limited to finding land. One account has him rescue shipwrecked sailors while returning to Greenland. He is also linked with the arrival or promotion of Christianity there. Again, the details vary. Conversion was not a single switch thrown on one afternoon. Older beliefs, Christian practice, family loyalties, and royal politics overlapped for years. The Leif of Vinland Saga is altered to serve the emotional story. He meets Thorfinn as a child, searches for him for years, finds him enslaved, and eventually helps him pursue Vinland. We do not have evidence that Leif spent his later life searching Europe for a missing Karlsefni. The historical Karlsefni seems to have met Leif as a successful adult after arriving in Greenland. According to the saga, he stayed at Leif's home at Brattahlid and married Gudrid. Yet the series preserves Leif's essential narrative role. He is the bridge between Iceland, Greenland, and the Western land. He proves that the horizon is not a wall. Whether he was the very first Norse person to see North America matters less to the story than the fact that his name became permanently attached to the crossing. Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir deserves equal attention. Vinland Saga introduces Gudrid later than Leif, but historically she is central to the Karlsefni tradition. The sagas portray her as an Icelandic woman whose travels carried her through Greenland, Vinland, and eventually, according to tradition, as far as Rome. Before marrying Karlsefni, she had already endured migration and the death of a husband. Her life, as remembered, crossed an astonishing portion of the medieval world. In the manga, Gudrid resists a marriage arranged for her and longs to sail. Her exact personality is a modern creative interpretation, but Norse women could manage farms, inherit under certain conditions, seek divorce under recognized circumstances, and play vital roles in migration. This should not be mistaken for complete equality. Their choices were constrained by family, wealth, law, and the risks of childbirth. Enslaved women possessed far fewer protections. Still, the image of women as passive figures left behind whenever men traveled is historically misleading. The spindle whorl found at Elant's Ox Meadows is a small but powerful sign that at least one woman was present at the Norse site. Gudrid and Karlsefni's marriage also helps explain why their story survived. Their descendants became important members of Icelandic Christian society, including bishops. Medieval genealogies were not decorative lists. They connected contemporary authority to remembered ancestors. An audience hearing the Vinland story might recognize it as the beginning of a family line still influential in their own time. This is one reason historians compare the two Vinland sagas instead of simply selecting the more exciting version. The saga of Eric the Red gives Karlsefni and Gudrid an especially prominent role. The saga of the Greenlanders distributes the western voyages among more members of Eric's family. Different traditions may have protected different reputations. The world connecting these people was held together by ships, but travel remained dangerous and slow. A voyage from Iceland to Greenland could miss its destination entirely. Fog, wind, currents, ice, sickness, damaged rigging, and limited food could turn a planned crossing into disappearance. Sailors did not possess modern charts, engines, or satellite forecasts. They used accumulated knowledge of routes, stars, daylight, winds, waves, birds, sea life, and the appearance of distant weather and land. Popular descriptions sometimes make navigation sound either magical or primitive. It was neither. Experienced sailors developed practical expertise suited to familiar routes. They also made mistakes. The discovery stories themselves repeatedly involve ships being blown off course, which may be the most realistic detail of all. Exploration could begin as failure. By the time Karlsefni reached Greenland, therefore, Vinland was probably not a fairy tale whispered by one aging man. It was a known opportunity discussed among people capable of financing ships and recruiting crews. Karlsefni's wealth made him useful. Gudrid's connection to Leif's family placed him near the center of Greenlandic leadership. The voyage west was dangerous, but it followed earlier reconnaissance. This historical Karlsefni sounds calm and practical compared with the knife-wielding child at the beginning of Vinland Saga. Yet the fictional biography is constructed around gaps in the evidence. We know little about Karlsefni's youth. We do not know every place he traveled before Greenland. Yukimura uses that silence to send him through the Danish conquest of England and the brutality of slavery before reconnecting him with the outline preserved in the sagas. That choice allows one fictional life to pass through several real historical worlds. Thorfinn meets an invented Askeladd, fights a historical Thorkell, encounters a historical Canute, and eventually grows into a version of a historical Atlantic explorer. The timeline has been bent, but not randomly. It pulls separate strands of the early 11th century around one witness. No strand is more brilliantly invented than Askeladd. There is no Danish-Welsh mercenary leader named Askeladd in contemporary English records who killed Thors, raised Thorfinn, protected Canute, and murdered King Sweyn. Askeladd's full secret identity, Lucius Artorius Castus, belongs to Vinland Saga's fiction. His death at Canute's hands is also fictional. Sweyn did not die in a royal hall after Askeladd cut off his head. But Askeladd is assembled from older material. His name recalls Askeladden, the ash-covered underdog of Norwegian folk tales. This figure is often the seemingly insignificant youngest person who succeeds through cleverness where stronger or more respected characters fail. The connection suits a leader who survives by reading people instead of overpowering everyone around him. Askeladd's background has also been linked by the creator to Olaf the Peacock from the medieval Laxdæla saga. Olaf was remembered as the son of an enslaved Irish princess and an Icelandic chieftain, a man of mixed heritage who grew into wealth and influence. Vinland Saga transforms that kind of saga ancestry into Askeladd's divided identity, the son of a Norse father and a Welsh mother, performing the role of a Danish raider while privately despising the world he leads. His Welsh loyalty is fictional in detail, but grounded in real geography. Wales in the early 11th century was not one unified modern nation-state. It contained changing kingdoms and dynasties, with rulers competing, cooperating, and defending themselves against neighbors. Welsh communities had inherited language and identity from post-Roman Britain. Contacts across the Irish Sea connected Wales with Ireland, Norse settlements, merchants, and raiders. Scandinavian attacks affected Welsh coasts, but the relationship was not a simple wall between two peoples. Trade, alliance, intermarriage, and conflict overlapped. The series presents Wales as a protected remnant of the world Askeladd's mother taught him to love. Roman ruins and the legend of Arthur give him a past older than the Danish armies surrounding him. This is thematically effective. After Roman rule ended in Britain, later communities remembered and reshaped the Roman past. Arthurian tradition grew over centuries, combining possible memories of post-Roman conflict with legend, literature, and political need. What is not historical is Askeladd's claim to be the direct heir of a precisely remembered Roman-British savior. Lucius Artorius Castus was the name of a real Roman military figure known from inscriptions, but proposed connections between that man and the later King Arthur tradition are debated. Vinland Saga uses the name as a symbol, not a proven genealogy. This distinction makes Askeladd more interesting. He is not secretly real simply because pieces of his identity come from history. He is a fictional man built to embody real historical pressures: enslavement, mixed ancestry, fading Roman memory, conflict between Wales and Scandinavian powers, and the need to choose between personal loyalty and political survival. His mercenary band is also plausible even though its exact members are invented. Viking forces were rarely uniform national armies. A leader gathered followers through reputation, payment, gifts, family connections, and the promise of loot. Crews could change allegiance. A warrior might serve a Danish king, accept English payment, and later fight beside former enemies. Loyalty was real, but it was maintained through relationships, not modern nationalism. Askeladd's control depends on knowing what his men want. Some want silver, some want battle, some follow familiar companions. Bjorn's devotion seems more personal, yet Bjorn himself is fictional. The mushroom he uses to enter a violent state draws on the popular image of berserkers, warriors said in later sources to fight with extraordinary fury. The exact nature of berserkers remains debated. There is no secure evidence that Viking warriors routinely consumed a specific hallucinogenic mushroom before battle. Suggestions have included intoxication, trance, performance, elite warrior identity, literary exaggeration, and later folklore. The image of a man temporarily transformed into an unstoppable beast is excellent drama, but it should not be treated as a documented military procedure. Real commanders had another method for inspiring aggression: social pressure. Men fought in front of relatives and companions whose opinions determined their honor. Poetry celebrated courage and mocked cowardice. A leader distributed rewards. The formation itself made retreat difficult. Fear did not disappear, it was managed. Askeladd also understands that the greatest weapon is information. This may be his most historically convincing quality. Medieval war involved negotiation, hostage-taking, bribery, deception, scouting, winter quarters, food supplies, and control of routes. A clever army that avoided a disastrous battle could outlast a stronger one. The heroic duel captures attention, but logistics decided campaigns. The fictional Askeladd leads us toward one of the story's most uncertain historical institutions, the Jomsvikings. Vinland Saga presents them as a disciplined military brotherhood based at Jomsborg, powerful enough to influence kings and punish deserters. Their fortress has rules, leaders, ships, and a fearsome reputation. Historical evidence is far less tidy. The Jomsvikings are described most fully in medieval Scandinavian narratives written generations after the period in which they were supposed to flourish. The saga of the Jomsvikings probably took shape around the beginning of the 13th century. It tells of an elite community in a Baltic fortress, governed by strict rules of courage and brotherhood. Members are expected not to flee, not to quarrel, and not to show fear. Some people and battles connected to the tradition are historical. The Baltic town of Wallin was a major settlement and trading center. Scandinavian, Slavic, and wider commercial networks met along that coast. A battle at Hjörungavagur in the late 10th century has support from skaldic poetry and other sources, though the saga version is highly literary. Commanders such as Sigvaldi and Thorkell appear in traditions and records of the wider era. What cannot be demonstrated is that every detail of Jomsborg and its warrior code existed exactly as later storytellers described it. Archaeologists and historians have long debated the fortress's location, organization, and even whether Jomsborg was a single institution recognizable from the saga. Wallin is a plausible setting behind the tradition, but identifying one excavated structure as the legendary headquarters remains difficult. Vinland Saga takes the legend at its most useful dramatic value. Jomsborg becomes the violent home Thor's rejects and the inherited power Thorfinn must later confront. Floki, like Thor's, is fictional. The conspiracy to murder Thor's is fictional. The exact chain of command is fictional. Yet the underlying Baltic world of fortified centers, professional retainers, ambitious chieftains, and competing kings is genuine. The Jomsviking Code also allows the series to explore how institutions turn reputation into control. A warrior does not need to be watched every moment if he has been taught that retreat will erase his identity. This idea resembles the moral pressure found in heroic literature, even if the written code itself is not a surviving military handbook. And among all the larger-than-life Jomsvikings in the story, one man steps directly out of history. Thorkell the Tall was real. The surviving sources do not tell us his exact height, and they certainly do not say that he could throw a spear through several men or use a log as a weapon. But they remember a Danish commander called Thorkell the Tall as one of the most formidable military figures of the early 11th century. He led armies, attacked England, entered English service, changed allegiance, became one of Canute's most powerful earls, and then vanished from the record. That career is so dramatic that the fictional version requires less invention than we might expect. The real Thorkell lived by war. He commanded a large fleet that reached England in 1009 and spent years campaigning across the south and east. Contemporary English annals describe towns attacked, regions burned, payments demanded, and defenses repeatedly failing. He was not a cheerful giant searching for entertaining opponents. That personality belongs to the manga. But a commander could not lead such a force for so long without experience, authority, and political intelligence. Runestones in Sweden add another kind of evidence. Some commemorate men who received payments in England under famous leaders, including Thorkell. These stones turn the distant campaigns into family memory. Silver won overseas might fund land, status, and monuments at home. A raid was not merely a moment of violence in England. Its profits changed communities across Scandinavia. The term Danegeld is often used for payments made to Scandinavian armies. English rulers hoped that silver could purchase peace or redirect attackers. The policy sounds cowardly when summarized as paying Vikings to go away, but governments have always paid, hired, bribed, and negotiated with dangerous forces. Raising a field army was expensive. A battle could destroy the political elite in one afternoon. Payment might give a kingdom time to rebuild. The problem was obvious. If an army received a fortune and left, another army could learn that England was rich and vulnerable. Some of the same men might return. Tribute could purchase a pause without solving the weakness that made tribute necessary. Thorkell's campaign reached one of its darkest moments at Canterbury. In 1011, the city fell and Archbishop Aelfhe was captured. The raiders demanded a ransom. According to the English tradition, Aelfhe refused to burden his people with the payment. After months in captivity, he was killed by members of the army during a drunken gathering at Greenwich. Accounts say the men struck him with bones and the back of an axe. Thorkell may have attempted to stop them, though the details were shaped by the archbishop's later sainthood. This event helps explain the historical Thorkell's complexity. Soon afterward, he and a fleet of ships entered the service of the English king Ethelred. Perhaps he had lost control of part of his army. Perhaps he recognized an opportunity. Perhaps the English offered terms too valuable to refuse. Medieval chroniclers could present a moral reason, but political decisions usually carried several motives at once. Vinland Saga moves Thorkell's break with the Danish forces into its story about the invasion led by Sweyn and Canute. It shows him defending London partly because fighting for the English gives him access to more exciting battles. That motivation is invented, but his service to Ethelred is historical. A famous Danish war leader really did defend the English king against other Danes. This is why modern national categories can mislead us. Thorkell did not necessarily believe he had betrayed an eternal Danish nation by accepting English service. Warriors followed rulers and agreements. England already contained communities with generations of Scandinavian settlement. Its political culture was neither purely English nor purely Danish. A man's lord, household, land, and reward could matter more than the language spoken by an enemy. The historical Thorkell later joined Canute. The route between those allegiances is not entirely clear, but by the end of the struggle he stood among the new king's most important supporters. Canute made him Earl of East Anglia. For several years, Thorkell was one of the strongest men in England after the king himself. Then the relationship broke. In 1021, Thorkell was outlawed or exiled. 2 years later, he and Canute were reconciled in Denmark. Thorkell was entrusted with major responsibility, and a son of Canute was associated with his care. After 1023, he disappears from secure historical notice. There is no confirmed final duel, no known grave, and no reliable account of his death. Vinland Saga turns that uncertainty into possibility. Its Thorkell can continue roaming wherever the narrative needs a living symbol of the warrior age. History simply loses sight of him. The contrast between Thorkell and Thors is therefore built around one real man and one invented man. Thorkell embraces the life that Thors rejects. He cannot understand peace as anything more than the empty interval before the next battle. Yet he recognizes strength and remembers Thors because, within his values, a warrior capable of leaving is almost incomprehensible. The real Thorkell's world was not driven by love of battle alone. His campaigns unfolded during a long crisis in England. To understand Canute's rise, we must move backward from the young prince of Vinland Saga to the generations of conflict that made his conquest possible. Scandinavian armies had attacked and settled in England since the 9th century. At times, large areas fell under rulers and legal traditions influenced by Danish settlement, a region later described by historians through the term Danelaw. York became a major Scandinavian center. Place names, language, trade, art, and family ancestry all recorded the depth of that presence. English kings eventually recovered political control over much of the territory, but the connection across the North Sea never disappeared. Denmark and England were not distant worlds meeting for the first time in Canute's childhood. Merchants, exiles, warriors, churchmen, and royal families moved between them. In 978, Ethelred became King of England while still young. His familiar nickname, the Unready, does not mean that he was perpetually late or unprepared in the modern sense. It comes from a word associated with poor counsel and forms a pun on his name. Ethelred can be understood as noble counsel. The nickname suggests counsel that was not sound. His reputation suffered because later observers knew how his reign ended. England faced repeated attacks, internal rivalry, unstable leadership, and enormous payments to hostile armies. Yet describing Ethelred as simply weak hides the difficulty of his position. He ruled a wealthy kingdom with sophisticated administration, coinage, law, and taxation. That wealth made England capable of resistance, but it also made England attractive. In 991, an English force was defeated at Maldon. The battle became the subject of a famous Old English poem celebrating warriors who remained with their lord even after the situation was hopeless. The poem's moral world resembles the heroic code explored in Vinland Saga. Courage means standing firm when survival would be easier. Modern readers may see waste, the poet sees loyalty. Payments to Scandinavian forces grew, new attacks followed. English defense suffered from political mistrust and commanders whose loyalty could shift. The kingdom could gather ships and armies, but coordination repeatedly failed. In 1002, Ethelred ordered the killing of Danes in England on St. Brice's Day. The exact extent of the massacre remains debated. It was probably impossible to kill every person of Danish ancestry across a kingdom where many had lived for generations and held local power. Archaeological discoveries at places such as Oxford have been discussed in connection with the violence, although linking individual remains to one written order is difficult. What matters is that the order existed, and that later tradition connected it with renewed Danish vengeance. Gunhild, described as a sister of Sweyn Forkbeard in some accounts, was supposedly among those killed. Her identity and the story's details are uncertain, but the massacre gave moral language to political war. Sweyn could invade as an avenger rather than merely a conqueror. Vinland Saga mentions the cruelty surrounding Danish and English relations, but it focuses on the campaign beginning in 1013. By then, Sweyn Forkbeard was an experienced king. He was the son of Harald Bluetooth, the ruler famously associated with the consolidation and Christianization of Denmark. The modern wireless technology called Bluetooth borrowed Harald's name centuries later because he was remembered as a unifier. Harald raised the Great Jelling Stone, announcing royal achievements and the conversion of the Danes. Archaeology reveals that Christianization was a gradual process, but kings found the new religion politically valuable. Christianity linked Scandinavian rulers to the diplomatic and sacred language of European monarchy. Bishops, churches, writing, and royal authority could reinforce one another. Sweyn's own rise involved conflict with his father. Saga accounts decorate that conflict with legendary figures such as Palnatoke, sometimes named as founder of the Jomsvikings. The reliable outline is that Sweyn became king of Denmark and spent years involved in warfare across the region. He attacked England more than once before the final conquest. In 1013, Sweyn returned with a major force. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle traces a rapid collapse of resistance. Regions submitted, hostages were given. London resisted because Ethelred and Thorkell were present, but Sweyn moved west and political support shifted toward him. By the end of the year, Ethelred fled to Normandy, where his wife Emma had family connections. Sweyn was accepted as king. His victory lasted only weeks. Sweyn died in February 1014. Later stories offered dramatic explanations, including supernatural punishment, but the cause is unknown. Vinland Saga replaces this sudden, unexplained death with Askeladd's sacrifice. The change produces one of the series' most powerful scenes, yet it completely transforms the history. The historical Sweyn was not killed by a Welsh-Danish commander protecting Prince Canute. Canute did not publicly strike down the assassin and seize control in that moment. Instead, the death of Sweyn reopened the political struggle. The Danish fleet recognized Canute as king, but leading English figures invited Ethelred to return if he agreed to govern more justly. Canute lacked enough support to hold the kingdom. He withdrew to Denmark. According to the Chronicle, he left mutilated hostages on the shore at Sandwich, a brutal warning that contrasts sharply with the hesitant prince introduced in Vinland Saga. The difference between the fictional and historical Canute is partly a question of age and partly a question of evidence. We do not know Canute's exact birth year. He may have been a teenager or a young adult during the campaigns. Sources written around royal courts had reasons to shape his image. Some emphasized his legitimacy, wisdom, Christian devotion, or martial ability. None gives us access to his private childhood. Vinland Saga uses that silence to create a dramatic transformation. Its Canute begins sheltered, frightened, and dependent on Ragnar. After Ragnar's death and a spiritual crisis, he rejects passive faith and decides to build paradise through royal power. Ragnar is fictional in this role, as is Askeladd's manipulation of the prince. The theological awakening is the author's interpretation, not an event described in the Chronicle. But Canute's later ambition is historical. After retreating to Denmark, he assembled support and returned to England in 1015. The campaign that followed was not a simple march from one battle to a crown. England was divided by the rivalry between Ethelred's family and the powerful nobleman Edric Striona. Ethelred's son Edmund, later called Ironside, emerged as Canute's most determined opponent. Canute's fleet landed at Sandwich and moved around the southern coast toward Wessex. Over the following months, alliances changed and armies crossed a kingdom exhausted by war. Uhtred of Northumbria submitted to Canute and was then killed, perhaps after being drawn into a meeting under promises of safety. Canute placed the Norwegian noble Eric of Hlathir, commonly called Eirik Hakanason, over Northumbria. Vinland Saga includes figures inspired by this network, but simplifies the contest around Canute's personal rise. Ethelred died in April 1016. London chose Edmund as king while other leaders supported Canute. This produced a year of rapid campaigning. Battles were fought at places including Penselwood, Schurston, Brentford, and Otford. Edmund repeatedly gathered new forces even after setbacks, earning the Ironside name through his resistance. The decisive battle came at Sandon in October 1016, though historians still debate the precise modern location. The English were defeated. Later sources blamed Edric Striona for abandoning the fight, but accusations against a hated political figure should be treated carefully. What is clear is that many important English nobles died. Canute and Edmund then negotiated a division of the kingdom. Edmund retained Wessex while Canute controlled territory to the north, with the expectation that the survivor would eventually inherit the whole. Edmund died only weeks later in November. Stories of assassination appeared, including an especially lurid tale involving a weapon used while he was in a privy, but there is no reliable proof. His death left Canute king of all England. This real path to power was longer and less personal than the manga's palace scene. Canute succeeded through ships, commanders, taxation, negotiation, marriage, fear, and the deaths of rivals. His reign did not begin with one perfect plan. It emerged from a political system breaking apart under sustained pressure. Once king, Canute had to become more than a Danish conqueror. An army can seize a kingdom, but it cannot remain permanently assembled in every village. He needed English institutions, church support, laws, taxes, local elites, and a story of legitimate rule. In 1017, he divided major regions among powerful earls. Thorkell received East Anglia, Eirik held Northumbria. Edric remained important in Mercia for a brief time before Canute ordered him killed. Wessex came increasingly under the influence of Godwin, whose family would dominate English politics before the Norman conquest. Canute also married Emma of Normandy, the widow of Aethelred. This was an extraordinary political union. Emma had been queen to the king Canute's father displaced. By marrying her, Canute connected himself to the previous dynasty and to Normandy. Their children gained a strong claim to succession. Emma's own commissioned narrative, the Encomium Emmi Regini, later presented events in a way favorable to her family, reminding us again that medieval sources carried political purpose. Vinland Saga's Canute talks about creating a paradise on earth while using violence to consolidate power. The historical Canute similarly cultivated a Christian kingship after conquest. He supported churches, issued laws, traveled to Rome, corresponded with subjects, and presented himself as a ruler within Christian Europe. This did not erase the violence of his rise. It transformed the language used to justify his authority. The famous story in which Canute commands the tide is often told as proof of arrogance. A foolish king believes even the sea must obey him. The older moral is almost the opposite. Canute orders the tide not to rise in order to demonstrate to flattering courtiers that earthly royal power has limits. The sea ignores him, and the king acknowledges that only divine power rules nature. Whether the demonstration happened exactly as later written is uncertain, but the story reflects the image Canute acquired. A ruler powerful enough that a lesson about humility required him to perform powerlessness. His realm eventually stretched across England, Denmark, and Norway, with influence in surrounding regions. Historians often call it the North Sea Empire, though it was not a centralized modern empire with one uniform administration. It was a collection of kingdoms connected through one ruler, his household, his ships, his deputies, and negotiated loyalties. Maintaining it required constant travel and political management. Canute could not be everywhere. When he was in England, someone had to secure Denmark. When he campaigned in Scandinavia, English earls governed in his absence. Powerful subordinates such as Thorkell could become both essential and dangerous. This is where the fictional Canute's suspicion of independent wealth and military power becomes historically convincing. Kings rewarded followers with land because they needed them, then feared those followers because land made them difficult to control. Canute's break and reconciliation with Thorkell fits that pattern even though the private reasons are lost. Canute died in 1035. His political union did not survive intact for long. Rival claims divided his family's inheritance. His sons Harold Harefoot and Harthacnut ruled England in succession, but both died young. In 1042, Edward the Confessor, a son of Aethelred and Emma, became king. The Danish conquest had reshaped England, yet the royal line displaced by Sweyn returned within a generation. Canute's real achievement was therefore immense but temporary. He conquered a wealthy kingdom, ruled it for almost 2 decades, and became one of the most powerful monarchs in northern Europe. He did not create a permanent Scandinavian superstate. Political systems built around one exceptional ruler often reveal their fragility when that ruler dies. Vinland Saga understands this problem. Its Canute believes sufficient authority can force the world toward peace. Thorfinn believes peace built by coercion remains dependent on violence. History cannot declare one of them philosophically correct, but Canute's empire demonstrates the limits of personal power. He could suppress rivals and stabilize England during his lifetime. He could not remove ambition, succession, geography, or human fear. The English campaigns shown in the series are built around real political events, but individual battles frequently combine invention with fragments of history. The defense of London is a good example. London resisted Scandinavian forces more than once. Its bridge, walls, river, and political importance made it difficult to take. A famous Old Norse poem celebrates an attack associated with Olaf Haraldsson, in which attackers supposedly pulled down London Bridge. The familiar children's rhyme about London Bridge is sometimes connected to this event, but that link is speculative. Vinland Saga turns the battlefield into a stage for Thorkell and Thorfinn. The personal duel is fictional. Thorfinn did not leap across the bridge as a young assassin serving Askeladd, yet the strategic setting is genuine. Control of a bridge could determine access across a river, movement of troops, and the survival of a city. The series also shows armies taking shelter during winter, crossing difficult country, consuming local supplies, and threatening villages. This is closer to the lived experience of war than any duel. Most civilians never saw the king whose ambition destroyed their harvest. They saw armed men demanding food. An army of thousands required enormous quantities of grain, meat, drink, fodder, firewood, and shelter. Supply lines were not modern convoys moving on paved roads. Forces lived partly from ships and partly from the land through purchase, taxation, requisition, or theft. A commander who could not feed his followers would lose them or watch them turn against the surrounding population. Winter did not automatically end medieval war, but it changed what was possible. Roads became mud, rivers changed, daylight shortened, animals weakened, and food stores mattered. Armies sought defensible quarters. The journey through frozen, mountainous Wales shown in Vinland Saga heightens the danger, but its central lesson is accurate. Weather could be a more relentless enemy than another army. The civilians killed by Askeladd's band during that winter episode are fictional individuals, yet the atrocity represents a common reality. Medieval chronicles often record burning, ravaging, and slaughter without naming ordinary victims. Their anonymity can make violence appear abstract. The series deliberately restores faces to the kind of sentence a chronicler might summarize in a few words. At the same time, we should resist the idea that every Viking army automatically murdered every village. Living peasants could produce food and taxes. Local submission was often more useful than destruction. Commanders negotiated with towns, accepted tribute, took hostages, and moved on. Violence had strategic purposes even when it escaped control. Hostages appear repeatedly in the historical record and in Vinland Saga. They were not prisoners in the modern criminal sense. A hostage embodied an agreement. A ruler or community surrendered a valuable person to guarantee obedience or payment. Harming hostages could be a deliberate declaration that trust had ended, as in the story of Canute mutilating those left from his father's campaign. The series' constant changes of allegiance can therefore seem chaotic to a modern viewer, but they reflect the period. Thorkell serves the English and later Canute. Local leaders submit to whoever can protect or punish them. Mercenaries fight for payment. Canute recruits men who once opposed his father. Political survival rewards flexibility, while heroic literature praises unchanging loyalty. That contradiction lies at the heart of the age. It also explains why a figure such as Askeladd feels so natural among historical people. He possesses no modern patriotism. He treats identity as something that can be performed, hidden, or weaponized. In a world of mixed armies and shifting lords, intelligence often means knowing which loyalty is permanent and which is only rented. But behind these kings and commanders stood the material culture of war. Vinland Saga's warriors carry round shields, axes, spears, bows, knives, and swords. In broad terms, this is accurate. The distribution and value of those weapons, however, tell us more than their appearance. The spear was practical and common. It required less metal than a sword and gave a fighter reach. Axes ranged from everyday tools adapted for violence to weapons made specifically for war. Bows mattered in hunting, ambush, and battle. A round wooden shield could protect most of the body when held correctly and was essential in group fighting. The sword carried special status. Producing a good blade required skill, material, and labor. Swords could be inherited, named, decorated, and displayed. Not every warrior owned one. When anime crowds give nearly every fighter a sword, they flatten the hierarchy visible in archaeological finds. Mail armor was valuable too. A well-made mail shirt represented countless iron rings and many hours of work. Helmets existed, but the iconic horned Viking helmet did not belong to ordinary Viking Age warfare. Horns would catch weapons and add weight without offering useful protection. The stereotype grew from later artistic traditions, not battlefield evidence. Vinland Saga generally avoids horned helmets, one of its welcome acts of restraint. It also dresses wealthier warriors differently from desperate recruits. The exact designs are stylized, but the principle is right. Equipment displayed status. Real wounds were less clean than animated combat. A cut that did not kill immediately could become infected. Broken bones, damaged joints, blood loss, exposure, and disease ended careers. There was no guarantee that a famous warrior survived a small wound simply because the story needed him later. The fear of injury helps explain the value of shields and formation. Duels appear throughout Vinland Saga, especially between Thorfinn and Askeladd. Formal single combat has roots in saga literature and legal tradition, but the rules varied across time and place. Icelandic stories describe holmgang, a regulated duel that could settle disputes, though the practice was eventually restricted or outlawed. A duel could be less costly than a feud involving entire families, but it could also be abused by experienced fighters challenging weaker opponents. Thorfinn's repeated bargain, completing dangerous missions in exchange for a chance to duel Askeladd, is invented. It functions psychologically rather than historically. Askeladd keeps the boy obedient by converting revenge into a reward system. The result resembles warrior service while remaining emotionally unique. The exaggerated fighters in the series are often interpreted as proof that Vinland Saga is not realistic. Physically, they are not. Thematically, their exaggeration reproduces the way stories preserve warriors. A saga hero may continue fighting after terrible wounds, defeat many opponents, or display impossible calm at death. Such scenes tell the audience what courage should look like, not what a medical observer would record. The Jomsviking execution scene, in which captured warriors remain defiant as they are killed, draws directly from this heroic tradition. The saga of the Jomsvikings famously celebrates condemned men who answer death with jokes, insults, and composure. Whether each speech was truly delivered is doubtful. Their literary purpose is unmistakable. The ideal warrior controls the only thing left to him, his response. Vinland Saga both admires and questions this ideal. The scene is thrilling because the men seem fearless, but the wider story asks what their courage produces. A person may die beautifully for a pointless cause. Honor can make suffering meaningful without making the war necessary. This tension prepares us for the part of Viking society that heroic stories often push into the background: slavery. When Thorfinn awakens on Ketil's farm, Vinland Saga changes its pace. Kings and battles move into the distance. The central questions become whether an enslaved person can recover a sense of self, whether labor can repair what violence has broken, and whether a peaceful farm is truly peaceful when its prosperity depends on ownership of human beings. Slavery was not an invention added to make the story darker. Enslaved people were a significant part of the Viking Age economy. Norse sources use the word thrall for a person held in bondage. People could be captured during raids, purchased through trade, born into enslaved status, or lose freedom through debt and punishment. Scandinavian networks carried captives from the British Isles, the Baltic, and Eastern Europe. Some were kept on farms, others were sold onward through long-distance markets. The surviving evidence is incomplete because enslaved people rarely controlled the written record. Archaeology can reveal restraints, household organization, unusual burials, and trade connections, but an object does not always tell us the legal status of the person who used it. Later laws describe categories of unfree people, yet laws may preserve ideals rather than everyday practice. Sagas provide individual stories, but they were written by and for free families whose ancestors occupied the center of society. Even with these limits, the existence of slavery is beyond doubt. The image of Vikings as explorers and traders becomes incomplete if the trade in human beings is omitted. A raid's most valuable cargo could be people. The series captures the uncertainty of enslaved life. Thorfinn and Einar can be promised freedom after clearing and cultivating land, but the promise depends on Ketil's authority. They cannot simply leave. Their labor produces value they do not fully own. Violence from retainers can threaten them even when the master presents himself as kind. There is no evidence that the historical Karlsefni was enslaved on a Danish farm. This entire period of Thorfinn's life is fictional. Einar, Arnheid, Ketil, Alma, and Snake, as depicted, are not documented companions of the historical explorer, but the conditions around them are assembled from real institutions. Enslaved people could sometimes gain freedom. A master might free a thrall, an enslaved person might purchase liberty, or service might end under an agreement. A freed person did not immediately become socially equal to an old landowning family. Status could remain attached to ancestry for generations. Freedom was a legal change, not the erasure of memory or prejudice. Thorfinn and Einar's agreement to create a field reflects the enormous labor required to expand a farm. Forest had to be cut, roots had to be removed, stones had to be carried, soil had to be broken and seed protected. Modern viewers accustomed to machines can underestimate the physical scale of clearing land with axes, animal power, and human hands. The work is repetitive, which is exactly why it becomes meaningful in the story. War destroys in seconds what agriculture takes seasons to build. A field cannot be created through one heroic gesture. It rewards patience, cooperation, and the willingness to continue when no audience is watching. Large estates existed, but the manga's farm should not be treated as a universal model of Danish agriculture. Farm size, ownership, labor, crops, and local authority varied. Most people lived closer to food production than modern city dwellers do. Barley, rye, oats, livestock, dairy products, fishing, gathering, and regional trade all contributed to survival. Wheat was more demanding and prestigious in some contexts. Hay was essential because animals had to survive winter. Ketil's position as a wealthy landowner surrounded by retainers is plausible. Power in rural society came from land, dependence, family alliances, generosity, and the ability to protect a household. A great farm was not merely a private business, it was a political center. People ate at the owner's table, worked his land, sought his judgment, and increased his reputation. The weakness of that system was personal dependence. If the master was unjust, frightened, or absent, there was no neutral institution capable of protecting everyone beneath him. Ketil's desire to see himself as gentle does not prevent cruelty. Vinland Saga understands that kindness without surrendering power can become another story an owner tells about himself. Arnheid's tragedy reflects the specific vulnerability of enslaved women. They could be subjected to domestic labor, sexual exploitation, forced partnership, sale, and separation from children. The exact life of every enslaved woman differed, but legal unfreedom made refusal dangerous. A household described by free people as stable could be a prison for someone inside it. Gardar's attempt to reclaim his family is fictional, yet raiding could destroy families exactly this way. A man might leave to fight over resources or honor and return to find his home attacked. Captives could be moved across the sea and renamed. The market converted one community's catastrophe into another household's labor. This is the economic shadow beneath Vinland Saga's great fleets. Ships did not sail only for kings. They carried silver, cloth, weapons, livestock, timber, luxury goods, and captives. Trade and raiding were not separate identities. The same crew could bargain peacefully in one harbor and use force in another. Canute's attempt to seize Ketil's estate also reflects the connection between royal government and land. Kings needed revenue to reward followers and maintain fleets. A rich estate represented food, tax, men, and strategic authority. Confiscation could punish an enemy while strengthening a supporter. The specific plot involving Ketil and Canute is fictional, but Canute did remove rivals and redistribute power after conquest. Royal peace did not mean that property was safe from the king. It often meant that the king claimed the exclusive right to decide whose violence and ownership were lawful. When Canute's trained soldiers face farmers and retainers, the result is predictable. The manga refuses the fantasy that courage alone makes inexperienced men equal to organized troops. Real battles could turn when a formation broke. Once men fled, they became easier to kill because shields no longer protected one another and panic spread faster than orders. Snake is shown as a professional warrior living at the edge of farm society. His name and precise past are fictional, but landowners often maintained armed followers. Retainers protected property, enforced decisions, and raised the owner's status. Some were experienced veterans, others simply had weapons and authority over people who did not. The Bible Snake reads is historically meaningful, though the exact book and language invite questions. Literacy in the 11th century was concentrated among clergy and elite environments. Christian texts were usually in Latin, with growing traditions in local languages. A traveling warrior reading scripture aloud would have been unusual but not impossible if he had received education. The story uses his literacy to connect the farm with a moral world larger than Ketil's rules. Christianity was expanding across Scandinavia during the lives of Canute and Karlsefni. Vinland Saga does not portray conversion as an instant replacement of one worldview by another, and this is accurate. A king could be baptized while many subjects retained older practices. A family might use Christian burial while preserving inherited customs. Names invoking Thor could continue after churches were built. Harald Bluetooth's gelling inscription famously associates him with making the Danes Christian. Royal declarations, however, are claims of achievement. They tell us what a ruler wanted remembered. Missionaries had worked in Scandinavian regions before Harald, and older religious practices continued afterward. The Old Norse religion was not organized through one universal scripture. Beliefs and rituals varied by time and place. Gods such as Odin, Thor, Freya, and Tyr appear in poetry, place names, objects, and later written texts. Local magnates could preside over feasts and sacrifices, tying religious authority to political generosity. At a blot, animals and perhaps in some contexts humans could be offered in exchange for divine favor. Food and drink were shared. Toasts reinforced relationships between gods, rulers, ancestors, and community. A great hall was therefore not only a dining room, it could be a stage where wealth became sacred authority. Vinland Saga's warriors often speak about Valhalla as if every fighter shares one simple expectation of an endless battle after death. Valhalla is genuinely part of Norse myth, associated with Odin and those selected from the slain, but later popular culture has turned it into a universal Viking heaven. Norse ideas about death were more varied. Burial practices, poetry, family traditions, and myths point towards several possible destinations and relationships with the dead. Not every farmer expected to enter Odin's hall, and not every Scandinavian worshipped the same gods in the same way. Some people were Christian, some probably blended practices. Religious identity could carry political meaning. Accepting the faith of a king might strengthen loyalty, while refusing it could become resistance. The priest Willibald in Vinland Saga is fictional. His appearance, behavior, and conversations with Canute are not recorded history. Yet his central question, what is love in a violent world, fits the theological culture around a Christian prince. Medieval clergy debated charity, sin, kingship, justice, and the proper use of force. A Christian ruler was expected to defend the church and maintain peace, even though warfare remained central to rule. Canute's rejection of a distant paradise and determination to make one on earth is a modern dramatic philosophy. Historical Canute did not leave a statement matching that transformation. What survives from his reign presents a king who used conventional Christian language. He could describe himself as ruling by divine favor, protect religious institutions, and seek recognition among Christian monarchs. This does not prove private sainthood. Political Christianity and personal belief cannot be cleanly separated. A ruler might sincerely believe while also understanding that churches offered administration, literacy, legitimacy, and connections across Europe. Canute's pilgrimage or journey to Rome in 1027 shows the scale of those connections. He attended the imperial coronation of Conrad II and wrote to his subjects about the journey. The conqueror whose father had attacked English churches now appeared among the great Christian rulers of Europe. Transformation was not only a theme for Thorfinn. Kings transformed their public identity too. Thorfinn's own rejection of violence during the farm story is not preserved from the historical Karlsefni. The sagas do not tell us that he swore never to harm another person. During conflict in Vinland, the Karlsefni of saga tradition prepares to defend his settlement. He is a leader responsible for the survival of his people, not an absolute pacifist. Yukimura therefore uses a historical destination while changing the moral purpose of the traveler. The real expedition belongs to the history of Norse expansion. The fictional expedition becomes an attempt to escape the logic of expansion. That distinction is crucial. Historical settlers did not arrive in an empty world. North America had been inhabited for thousands of years. Calling it a new world describes European awareness, not human reality. Indigenous societies possessed their own territories, languages, trade, memories, and political relationships long before a Norse sail appeared. Vinland Saga increasingly centers this problem. Thorfinn wants land where nobody will be harmed, but his dream requires entering a place where people already live. The contradiction is not an accidental obstacle added at the end. It is the historical truth waiting inside the word Vinland. Before reaching that western shore, the story sends Thorfinn through trade routes extending east and south. The manga's Baltic Sea journey, encounters with Jomsviking politics, and sale of narwhal horns reveal another accurate feature of the Norse world: its extraordinary connectivity. Scandinavian merchants traveled into the river systems of Eastern Europe. They reached centers associated with the Rus and moved goods toward Byzantium and the Islamic world. Silver coins from distant regions have been found in Scandinavian hoards. Furs, amber, wax, weapons, cloth, beads, slaves, and luxury goods crossed enormous distances through many hands. The people commonly called Varangians served as traders, warriors, and eventually elite guards in Byzantium. The exact identities within these networks changed over time. Not everyone sailing an eastern river was ethnically Scandinavian. Norse travelers entered Slavic, Finnic, Baltic, Byzantine, and Islamic commercial worlds. This matters because Vinland was not an isolated miracle. It was the western edge of a society already accustomed to long-distance movement. The same broader age connected Newfoundland with Greenland and Iceland, while other routes connected Scandinavia to Constantinople and beyond. Narwhal tusk, often marketed as unicorn horn in medieval Europe, later became one of Greenland's distinctive luxury exports. Vinland Saga uses such a valuable product to finance Thorfinn's ambitions. The chronology and individual transaction are fictional, but the economic logic is strong. Rare northern materials became more valuable the farther they traveled from their source. Walrus ivory was especially important to medieval Greenland's economy. Hunting expeditions reached distant grounds, and ivory moved into European markets. Dependence on luxury trade created opportunity but also vulnerability. If demand changed, if shipping declined, or if political connections weakened, isolated settlements suffered. The manga's Baltic conflict also returns to Floki and the Jomsvikings. Historically, the 11th century Baltic contained fortified settlements, royal competition, piracy, trade, tribute, and shifting influence among Danes, Norwegians, Swedes, Slavic rulers, and local elites. The series compresses that complexity into a family struggle over leadership. Garm, the spear-wielding fighter who seeks excitement like a younger and more dangerous reflection of Thorkell, is fictional. His nearly supernatural speed and obsession with combat belong to the manga's heightened warrior class, yet his inability to imagine a life outside battle reflects a genuine social problem. Men trained and rewarded for violence did not automatically become peaceful when a campaign ended. Warbands offered belonging, income, reputation, and purpose. A young man without secure land might see military service as one of the few paths upward. Ending war could threaten his livelihood. Kings who wanted peace still needed to employ or disperse armed followers. Thorfinn defeats Garm not through greater rage, but by understanding the emptiness of provocation. The scene echoes Askilad's old ability to control Thorfinn's emotions. Historically, we cannot know whether Karlsefni underwent such lessons. As narrative, It shows that the skills learned in war can be redirected without pretending they never existed. Thorfinn's relationship with Hild carries the same theme. Hild is fictional, as is the murder of her father by Thorfinn. Female hunters, craftspeople, travelers, and household leaders certainly existed, but we do not possess a historical record of a crossbow-wielding woman following Karlsefni to judge his commitment to non-violence. The crossbow itself was known in medieval Europe, though its precise form, availability, and local use varied. Hild's highly engineered weapon reflects her role as an inventor as much as a historical norm. Her importance is moral. The victim of Thorfinn's earlier life remains alive and is allowed to evaluate his change. History rarely gives us that perspective. Chronicles name kings who ordered a region ravaged, but seldom record the child who survived. Vinland Saga invents Hild so that transformation cannot become self-forgiveness without accountability. Gudrid, Hild, Einar, Bugeyes, and the others who gather around Thorfinn are therefore mostly literary companions attached to a historical expedition. Gudrid alone comes directly from the central saga tradition, though her fictional characterization remains creative. The crew allows the manga to assemble different relationships to violence, migration, slavery, gender, and home aboard one ship. Bugeyes even shares Thorfinn's name in Japanese contexts, a reminder that names repeat. Historical identification is rarely as simple as finding one familiar name. Genealogy, location, patronymic, nickname, and chronology distinguish individuals. Thorfinn literally means something like Thor's fin, and it was not unique to Karlsefni. The historical Karlsefni's father is given as Thord Horsehead in saga genealogy, not Thor's the Troll of Jom. His wife is Gudrid. Their son Snorri occupies a special place in tradition because he was said to have been born during the Vinland venture, making him among the earliest children of European ancestry born in North America. The wording requires care. He was not the first child born in North America. Indigenous children had been born across the continent for countless generations. He was significant within the Norse and later European story of Atlantic travel. In the manga, Karli is an adopted child traveling with the group, while the historical name Snorri remains associated with Karlsefni and Gudrid's family. Yukimura is not simply illustrating the genealogy. He rearranges family roles to explore chosen responsibility before biological parenthood. By the time the real Karlsefni planned his expedition, Norse Greenland had only a small population. Estimates vary, and the total changed over time, but it was tiny compared with the indigenous populations spread across North America. Every ship and experienced adult committed to Vinland represented a significant share of Greenland's available resources. The two sagas give different numbers and structures for the expedition. The saga of the Greenlanders describes Karlsefni sailing with 60 men and 5 women. The saga of Eric the Red presents a larger venture involving multiple ships and more than 100 people. These figures may reflect different traditions, literary choices, or separate expeditions later combined. Both versions understand that lasting settlement required women and livestock, not only warriors. A raiding camp can survive as a temporary male military community. A colony must reproduce, feed itself, repair tools, manage animals, raise children, and endure winters. The historical party likely carried iron tools, weapons, food, rope, sailcloth, timber components, clothing, and the knowledge needed to build in turf and wood. Ships were both transportation and a lifeline home. Damage that seems minor at a modern dock could become fatal where no replacement parts existed. The route from Greenland probably moved north or northwest before turning along coasts, depending on departure point, weather, and destination. The saga's name lands usually interpreted as Helluland, Markland, and Vinland. Helluland, the land of flat stones, is often associated with Baffin Island or northern Labrador. Markland, the forest land, is generally linked with Labrador. Vinland lay farther south, but its exact geographical meaning remains debated. The name Vinland has traditionally been understood as wine land, connected with wild grapes described in the sagas. Some scholars have debated linguistic alternatives, including interpretations involving meadow or pasture, but wine land remains influential. Grapes do not grow at Elance Ox Meadows today. That does not disprove the saga. Vinland may have named a broad region, and Norse travelers from the Newfoundland base reached farther south where wild grapes and butternuts grew. This brings us at last to the Western journey itself, where literature and archaeology come closer than almost anywhere else in Vinland Saga. The saga of the Greenlanders says Leif established buildings in the western land before Karlsefni arrived. Karlsefni later used the earlier camp, traded with local people, spent multiple winters, and attempted to build a stable settlement. The saga of Erik the Red organizes events differently and gives Karlsefni a larger leadership role. It names places such as Stromfjord, the fjord of currents, and Hop, a more fertile area. The landscapes sound both observational and literary. There are strong currents, long beaches, forests, animals, fish, cold winters, and attractive resources. Sailors name unfamiliar coasts by visible qualities, exactly as explorers often do. Yet attempts to match every name with one modern bay can produce false certainty. The saga map is made of narrative distance, not measured coordinates. A ship sails for a certain number of days under favorable wind. A coast lies to one side. A landmark appears. Copyists and storytellers can alter a number or direction. Modern currents and coastlines do not reproduce one medieval voyage. What archaeology provides is a fixed point. At the northern tip of Newfoundland stands Elance Ox Meadows, the remains of a Norse site dating to the period of the Vinland voyages. Its discovery transformed the debate. North America was no longer only a possibility preserved in medieval stories. Norse people had built and worked there. The site contains the remains of timber-framed turf buildings similar to those used in Iceland and Greenland. There were halls, workshops, and evidence of ironworking. Bog iron was processed, producing iron that could be used for essential repairs such as ship rivets. Woodworking took place. The settlement was positioned near the sea, a practical base for crews whose survival depended on ships. It does not resemble a large self-sustaining colony. There are no clear barns, fields, or extensive livestock structures. Few personal objects were left behind. The evidence suggests a temporary base occupied for a limited period, perhaps used repeatedly, rather than a town growing across generations. The buildings could accommodate a substantial group, possibly several ship crews. Their size implies organized leadership. This is one reason figures such as Leif or Karlsefni remain plausible candidates for the kind of person behind the site, though archaeology cannot attach a surviving name tag to the chief's hall. A spindle whorl indicates textile work and the presence of women. A ringed pin reflects connections with the wider Norse world. Iron slag shows technological activity distinct from local indigenous traditions of the period. Each object supports an identity that the architecture already strongly suggests. Then there are the butternuts. Butternut trees did not grow around the northern Newfoundland site. Their natural range lay farther south, including areas around the Gulf of St. Lawrence and New Brunswick. The discovery of butternut material at Elance Ox Meadows shows that people at the camp had traveled or obtained resources from a warmer region. This small piece of evidence helps reconcile the grapes of the sagas with a base too far north for grapes. Elance Ox Meadows may have been the gateway, not the whole of Vinland. Crews could repair ships and overwinter there before exploring southward. In 2021, researchers produced an exact calendar year for Norse activity at the site, 1021. They examined wood cut with metal tools and used a spike in atmospheric radiocarbon caused by a cosmic event in 993. By identifying that signal in tree rings and counting outward to the bark, they determined when the trees were cut. The result does not prove that every building was constructed in 1021 or that Karlsefni personally held the axe. It proves that Norse activity occurred there in that year. The date falls comfortably within the broad era indicated by the saga traditions. A story copied centuries later and a physical tree cut on another continent suddenly meet within the same generation. This is the most astonishing historical fact behind Vinland Saga. Its central destination is not merely inspired by a legend that historians politely tolerate. A Norse presence in Newfoundland is archaeologically certain. What remains uncertain is which saga expedition corresponds to the site. Was it Leif's camp, Karlsefni's settlement, a base used by several voyages? Did oral tradition combine repeated journeys into a few named adventures? The current evidence cannot give one final answer. And the name Elance Ox Meadows is modern, with a history connected to local French and English usage. It is not a surviving Norse label. Identifying it absolutely as Leifsbudir or Stromfjord goes beyond what the artifacts alone can establish. The site is also older in human significance than the Norse buildings. Indigenous peoples used the area for thousands of years before the Viking Age and returned after it, presenting Elance Ox Meadows as the moment history arrived would erase most of its history. The Norse did not discover a continent in the sense of revealing uninhabited land. They discovered it for their own connected world. The people already there did not need discovery. The sagas call the local inhabitants Skraelinga, a Norse term whose exact origin is debated and which became dismissive. It does not identify one specific people with certainty. Depending on where encounters occurred, Norse voyagers could have met ancestors of the Beathuk in New Mi'kmaq or other indigenous communities, while Dorset culture communities lived farther north. Scholars must avoid turning a vague outsider's label into one fixed ethnic identity. The saga accounts describe both trade and violence. Local people approach with furs. The Norse offer goods including cloth or food. Weapons are withheld. A misunderstanding or killing then transforms the relationship, and a larger attack follows. Details differ between the narratives. Dairy products play a memorable role in one account, where the visitors enjoy or react strongly to milk-based food. Another scene features a bull frightening them. Such details may preserve distant memories of genuine cultural encounter, but they may also be literary devices emphasizing difference. The basic pattern is credible. Two groups without a shared language meet. Each evaluates the other's numbers, tools, intentions, and resources. Trade creates a temporary structure for contact. Fear, theft, accident, or violence can destroy it quickly. Neither side possesses complete information. The manga expands this encounter through named indigenous characters and a sustained relationship with the settlers. Those personalities and conversations are creative, not preserved historical biography. This gives the story room to imagine the perspectives the Norse sources fail to record. That choice is essential because the medieval sagas tell the meeting from one side. Indigenous oral histories and archaeology belong to different traditions of evidence. We cannot assume that Norse misunderstandings accurately describe the people they met. The balance of power also differed from later European colonization. The Norse were a tiny expedition thousands of kilometers from support. Indigenous communities knew the landscape, food sources, seasons, routes, and neighboring peoples. The newcomers possessed iron weapons and ocean-going ships, but technology did not cancel distance or numbers. This is why the saga explanation for abandonment makes practical sense. Karlsefni concludes that although the land is valuable, conflict makes settlement too dangerous. A handful of ships could not conquer or continually defend a vast inhabited coast. Greenland lacked the population to send endless reinforcements. Distance multiplied every problem. From Greenland to northern Newfoundland was a major ocean crossing. Continuing south added further travel. A damaged ship, failed harvest, lost crew, or hostile encounter could not be solved by requesting supplies that arrived next week. News itself moved only as fast as a ship. The settlement appears to have been abandoned deliberately. Valuable tools were removed rather than scattered across a scene of sudden destruction. There are no Norse graves securely identified at the site. The small amount of refuse suggests limited occupation. 2 holes may have burned, but fire alone does not prove an attack. Buildings could burn accidentally or be destroyed intentionally when a camp was closed. This orderly departure differs from the image of a last heroic stand. The likely conclusion is more practical. The venture cost too much, demanded too many people, and offered returns that could not justify the risks. Yet leaving did not mean forgetting. Markland's timber remained useful to Greenland, and later written references suggest Western lands remain known. A 14th century Icelandic record mentions a small Greenland ship blown off course after traveling from Markland. This indicates that voyages, or at least knowledge of the route, persisted beyond the first expeditions, though no permanent Norse colony took root. Vinland Saga asks whether Thorfinn's settlement can escape that ending. History has already answered for Karlsefni. The attempt did not last. The emotional power comes from watching fictional people move toward a failure the audience knows is waiting. Failure, however, depends on the goal. If Karlsefni intended to establish a permanent colony, he failed. If he intended to explore, gather resources, trade, and return with valuable cargo, the voyage may have succeeded. The saga of the Greenlanders says his returning ship carried great wealth. A short-lived expedition can be commercially profitable even when a settlement disappears. Karlsefni and Gudrid returned across the Atlantic. Saga tradition eventually places them on a farm in northern Iceland. Their family entered the genealogies of prominent Icelanders. The explorer who crossed the ocean did not spend the rest of his life endlessly searching for another battlefield. He became an ancestor. Gudrid's remembered life continued even farther. One tradition says that after Karlsefni's death she traveled to Rome, then returned to Iceland and lived a religious life. The journey is possible within the connected Christian world of the 11th century, but its details are difficult to verify. Medieval family memory had reason to portray the ancestress of bishops as a devout pilgrim. Whether every stage happened exactly as described, Gudrid's story challenges the idea that medieval women never traveled. Her remembered route stretches from Iceland to Greenland, North America, and continental Europe. Few characters better represent the geographic scale hidden behind the phrase Dark Ages. The term Dark Ages itself can mislead. The period was not dark to the people living in it, nor was it empty of innovation and connection. The phrase originally reflected the scarcity of certain written sources and an older judgment that the centuries after Rome represented decline. Vinland Saga's world contains sophisticated ships, legal assemblies, international trade, poetry, metalworking, agriculture, royal administration, and competing religious philosophies. It is violent but not simple. Even daily appearance is more complicated than the familiar stereotype. Norse people cared for clothing and grooming. Combs are common archaeological finds. Textiles demanded enormous skill and labor, usually performed by women. Wool had to be prepared, spun, dyed, woven, cut, and repaired. A sail large enough for an ocean-going ship represented an extraordinary investment of fiber and work. The colorless, permanently muddy Viking is therefore as misleading as the horned helmet. Dyes produced reds, blues, yellows, browns, and other shades depending on materials and wealth. Jewelry, brooches, belts, beads, and weapon fittings displayed identity and status. Clothing shown in Vinland Saga is simplified for visual storytelling, but its world is appropriately more colorful than older cinema often imagined. We should also be cautious about tattoos. A 10th century traveler named Ahmad ibn Fadlan described the bodies of ruse traders with dark designs extending from fingers toward the neck, often interpreted as tattoos. The exact meaning and the relationship of those ruse to Scandinavian culture are debated. That one description does not prove every Viking was tattooed from head to toe. Vinland Saga avoids making elaborate tattoos a universal uniform, which is historically sensible. Hair and beards varied as well. Nicknames such as Forkbeard and Bluetooth could preserve distinctive appearance, but they might also have meanings that are no longer clear. A nickname was a practical tool in societies where the same personal names repeated. The historical record includes men identified as the Tall, the Red, the Good, the Stout, Harefoot, Ironside, and many stranger forms. Some nicknames were praise, others were jokes or insults that outlived their owner. Karlsefni's own nickname sounds complimentary, but its nuance is difficult to translate perfectly. When modern English selects one meaning, it can make an uncertain historical identity appear more precise than it was. Language in the story is another invisible compromise. Characters from Iceland, Denmark, Norway, England, Wales, France, and beyond speak to one another because the audience needs a coherent narrative. In history, the linguistic landscape was complex. Old Norse dialects were spoken across much of Scandinavia and the North Atlantic. Old English was related closely enough that some basic communication may have been possible, especially in regions with long Scandinavian settlement, but the languages were not identical. Welsh belonged to a different language family. Clergy used Latin. Trade encouraged multilingual people, interpreters, borrowed words, and simplified forms of communication. English absorbed substantial Norse influence. Everyday words and place names record generations of contact. Pronouns such as they, their, and them entered English through Norse influence. Places ending in by often point to Scandinavian settlement. Language remembers migration long after a king's empire falls. Names also change when they cross languages. Canute may appear as Cnut, Nut, or Nud. Swain may be Svein, Sven, or Svend. Ethelred may be written with letters modern keyboards rarely use. These forms do not necessarily identify different people. They reflect Old Norse, Old English, modern national spellings, and editorial choices. Vinland Saga selects forms that are recognizable and pronounceable across Japanese and international audiences. Historical accuracy sometimes requires accepting several correct spellings rather than insisting on one. Food in the series similarly combines broad accuracy with artistic convenience. People ate grains, bread, porridge, dairy, meat, fish, vegetables, berries, and preserved foods according to region and season. Fermentation, drying, smoking, salting, and souring helped food survive. The northern winter made storage a matter of life and death. Large warriors consuming mountains of meat fit a feast scene, but ordinary households could not slaughter valuable livestock every day. Animals provided milk, wool, transport, breeding stock, and manure. Meat consumption depended on wealth, season, and local resources. Fish was crucial in coastal communities and eventually became a major export. Alcoholic drinks such as ale and mead held social and ritual importance. Clean water was also consumed. Medieval people did not survive by drinking alcohol every waking hour. Feasting allowed a leader to display generosity. A cup moving around a hall bound followers to a household, which is why arguments and boasts at feasts could carry political danger. The series' villages are built in timber and turf because these were essential materials. In Iceland and Greenland, turf offered insulation where large timber was scarce. A turf building could appear to rise from the earth, with thick walls protecting inhabitants from wind. It required maintenance and could become smoky or damp, but it was an intelligent response to local conditions. Inside, fire provided warmth, light, and cooking. Smoke management varied by building. Personal space was limited. People worked, ate, told stories, repaired equipment, and slept near others. Animals might occupy connected spaces or nearby structures. Privacy was a luxury. This helps us imagine how stories survived before writing. Winter evenings brought households together. Poems and family narratives could be performed repeatedly. Skilled poets preserved complicated forms through memory. The spoken word was not careless simply because it was unwritten. Skaldic poetry is particularly valuable to historians because its strict meter and dense language could preserve old wording. Poems composed near an event may offer earlier evidence than sagas written centuries later. Yet poetry praises patrons and uses metaphor. It must be interpreted, not copied as literal transcript. Runestones provide another contemporary voice. Many are memorials raised by relatives. They may say that a man died abroad, received payment in England, owned land, built a bridge, or served a leader. Their messages are brief because carving stone demands labor. Together, they map ambition and grief across the Scandinavian world. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle offers a different perspective. It was produced and continued in English religious centers, with several manuscript versions. Its entries record raids, royal deaths, taxes, battles, and signs in the sky. It is closer in time to Canute than the Icelandic family sagas, but it is not neutral. Its writers experienced the invasions from within English political and Christian society. The Chronicle may describe an army as heathen even when some members were baptized. It may blame a commander for treachery because later tradition despised him. Different manuscript versions select and phrase events differently. Contemporary does not mean unbiased. Canute's charters, laws, coins, letters, and church patronage show the ruler he wished subjects to see. Coins are especially powerful propaganda. A standardized royal image circulates through thousands of daily transactions. Every payment reminds the user whose authority guarantees the currency. Archaeology then tests all these narratives against objects and landscapes. Coins can reveal trade and political control. Mass graves reveal violent death, but not always the killer's names. Isotope analysis can suggest where a person grew up. Ship burials display wealth and ritual while representing only a tiny elite. No single kind of evidence is enough. The real history behind Vinland Saga emerges from disagreement among chronicles, poems, sagas, laws, inscriptions, buildings, graves, environmental evidence, and modern scientific dating. That is why a simple list of real and fictional characters can only be a beginning. Thorfinn Karlsefni was real, but his childhood in the story is fictional. Leif Erikson was probably real, but the order of his discoveries is disputed. Gudrid was likely real, but her personality and some travels are preserved through family saga. Thorkell was unquestionably a major historical commander, while his superhuman strength is fiction. Sweyn and Canute were kings documented by contemporary sources, while their private conversations are imagined. Thor's is fictional but represents plausible migration and a timeless moral conflict. Askeladd is fictional but built from saga motifs, Welsh history, mixed identity, and the politics of mercenary service. Floki, Bjorn, Ragnar, Willibald, Einar, Arnheid, Snake, Hild, and Garm perform narrative roles rather than reconstructing known biographies. The Jomsvikings occupy the uncertain space between legend and history. Even the real characters are placed together in ways the evidence does not support. There is no record that Karlsefni served under Thorkell or met Canute. There is no evidence that Canute's conquest transformed Karlsefni from an assassin into a pacifist. Their historical lifetimes overlap enough to make the encounter feel possible, and fiction turns possibility into meaning. The ages and dates are also adjusted. A precise timeline for Karlsefni's birth and voyage remains uncertain. The secure evidence of Norse activity at Elant's Ox Meadows in 1021 does not automatically date every saga event. Vinland Saga arranges its chronology to connect Thorfinn's development with the political crisis of 1013 to 1018 and later voyages. This compression is not a failure of research, it is the method of historical fiction. The creator takes people who represent different forces within one era and places them close enough to collide. Thorkell becomes war without restraint. Canute becomes peace imposed from above. Askeladd becomes survival through manipulation. Thor's becomes the refusal to dominate. Thorfinn must carry something from each of them. The visual violence is exaggerated for the same reason. A warrior cutting through dozens of enemies makes his worldview impossible to ignore, but the story repeatedly shows that strength does not solve the question underneath. Thorkell can defeat almost anyone and still cannot create a life beyond battle. Canute can rule kingdoms and still cannot control every consequence. Thor's can reject killing but cannot protect his son from grief. Thorfinn can survive war but cannot undo the dead. The historical record is filled with powerful people confronting similar limits. Sweyn conquered England and died within weeks. Canute built a North Sea realm that fragmented after his death. Thorkell rose high enough to become dangerous even to the king he served, then disappeared. Karlsefni crossed an ocean but could not maintain a colony. Seen this way, Vinland Saga's departures from history reveal its deepest historical insight. The Viking Age was not moving inevitably toward larger conquest. Every victory was temporary, ships decayed, alliances changed, sons fought over inheritance, farms returned to weeds, names survived only if someone repeated them. The Norse settlements in Greenland lasted far longer than the Vinland camp, but they eventually disappeared as living communities. The causes remain debated and likely interacted. Climate change, economic shifts, reduced trade, political isolation, environmental pressures, and migration all played roles. There is no need for one sudden disaster to explain the end. Greenland's Norse inhabitants adapted over centuries. They changed hunting patterns and continued participating in Atlantic trade. Describing them as stubborn Europeans who refused all adaptation oversimplifies the archaeology, but small communities at the end of long supply routes remained vulnerable to changes beyond their control. Indigenous Greenlandic communities endured through different knowledge, mobility, and relationships with the environment. Their history must not appear only as background to Norse arrival and disappearance. The North Atlantic was not an empty stage built for European explorers. Iceland's Norse-descended society, by contrast, survived and preserved the language in which the Vinland stories were written. Christianity brought manuscript culture. During the 12th, 13th, and later centuries, Icelandic writers recorded law, poetry, kings, histories, family sagas, myth, and genealogy. The Vinland voyages were written down roughly 2 centuries after they occurred. Imagine trying to reconstruct a voyage today using stories transmitted since the early 19th century, then combining them with family claims and literary expectations. Some names and destinations might remain exact. Conversations would change, separate journeys might merge, a dramatic death might move to the person who best fits it. Yet oral memory can preserve remarkable truths. The archaeological confirmation of a Norse site demonstrates that dismissing the entire tradition as fantasy would have been wrong. The correct response is neither blind belief nor blind skepticism. It is comparison. The saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Erik the Red agree that Norse people reached lands west of Greenland, that Leif's family was involved, that Karlsefni and Gudrid joined a settlement attempt, that local inhabitants were encountered, and that the venture ended. Their disagreement about sequence and leadership shows where memory had become contested. Elance Ox Meadows confirms presence, building tradition, ironworking, ship-related activity, travel farther south, and an early 11th century date. It does not confirm every speech, battle, or family scandal. Archaeology supports the frame while leaving the human drama open. Freydis, daughter of Erik the Red, illustrates the problem perfectly. In one saga tradition, she displays terrifying courage during an indigenous attack, standing her ground when others flee. In another, she engineers the murder of fellow Norse settlers and personally kills women the men refuse to execute. These portraits are so different that they may preserve hostile family traditions, literary invention, separate events, or different women combined under one name. Vinland Saga can choose how to use such figures because history cannot provide a camera. Every adaptation must decide whether uncertainty becomes mystery, conflict, or silence. The manga's greatest invention is to make the collapse of settlement a moral test, rather than only a logistical result. Historical explanations emphasize population, distance, resources, and conflict. Thorfinn's story asks whether fear itself can defeat peace. A weapon enters the settlement because some people believe peace without defense is naive. Indigenous leaders observe the newcomers and consider the danger they may bring. Misunderstandings grow. Illness introduces a force no leader can negotiate with. Each side can interpret preparation by the other as proof that its own fear was justified. This pattern belongs to history far beyond Vinland. An attempt to become safer can make a neighbor feel less safe. The neighbor responds. Both sides then point to the response as evidence that distrust was correct. Violence can begin before either side consciously chooses conquest. The historical sagas describe conflict, but do not give us enough information to reconstruct its causes. The manga fills that gap with personalities, factions, and ethical decisions. It cannot claim to reveal what truly happened. It uses what might have happened to examine why settlements fail. Thorfinn's refusal to kill, therefore, separates him sharply from the historical logic of colonization. A settlement usually claims land, defines boundaries, stores weapons, and enforces authority. Thorfinn wants a community that will leave rather than conquer. That commitment makes his project morally unusual and practically fragile. The real Karlsefni also chose to leave. We do not know whether that decision came from compassion, strategic calculation, economic disappointment, or all three. The sagas suggest that the settlers recognized they could not remain safely amid conflict. Withdrawal may have saved lives. In heroic literature, retreat often looks shameful. In colonization history, retreat can be the decision that prevents a larger war. This possibility brings Karlsefni closer to Yukimura's Thorfinn than their fictional childhood would suggest. Both become memorable not because they conquered Vinland, but because they did not. No North American kingdom carried Karlsefni's name. No dynasty ruled from Elant's ox meadows. The camp returned to grass. The people already living across the region continued their own histories. The Norse achievement was the crossing itself and the memory of contact. Centuries later, European colonization of the Americas followed on a scale the Greenlanders could never have supported. States, investors, larger populations, gunpowder weapons, transatlantic shipping systems, and devastating disease produced a very different balance. It would be misleading to treat Karlsefni's small expedition as the direct beginning of those later empires. It would be equally misleading to make the Norse voyage a competition over which European deserves credit for discovering America. The continent was not waiting to be found. The more meaningful historical question is how human societies separated by the Atlantic met, what each understood, and why contact remained brief. Vinland Saga's title invites us to imagine Vinland as the destination of one man's moral journey. Historically, Vinland was probably a flexible regional name, a collection of coasts and resources remembered by sailors. It may have included northern Newfoundland as a base and lands farther south as destinations. It was not one peaceful country with fixed borders. The peaceful Vinland Leif describes to young Thorfinn is therefore a promise created by distance. Every faraway land becomes simpler in the telling. The listener fills unknown space with whatever home lacks. To enslaved people, Vinland means freedom. To merchants, it means resources. To farmers, land. To warriors, perhaps another place to take. To Thorfinn, it becomes proof that a different life is possible. The real sailors likely carried the same variety of motives. Exploration rarely belongs to pure curiosity. People cross oceans because of profit, pressure, faith, status, exile, family, ambition, and hope. One ship can hold all of those reasons at once. That complexity explains why Vinland Saga feels authentic even when the plot is invented. It does not use history as a costume placed over modern heroes. It builds characters from the contradictions visible in the age. Its Vikings are capable sailors and brutal raiders. Its Christian king speaks of love and orders deaths. Its gentle landowner owns people. Its pacifist survives because he is exceptionally dangerous. Its paradise requires entering someone else's homeland. Every solution creates another problem. The series is also honest about the limits of individual goodness. Thorfinn can make a vow, but he cannot control every settler. Canute can issue a law, but he cannot remove human ambition. A leader's values matter, yet a community is made of people who carry their own memories and fears. History offers the same warning. We often tell the Viking age through exceptional names because names make a story manageable. But Canute did not row every ship, harvest every field, mint every coin, or make every treaty. Thousands of unnamed people created the world attached to his reign. The same is true at Elant's Ox Meadows. We do not know who cut the 3 pieces of wood dated to 1021. The person may have been a free sailor, an enslaved laborer, an experienced carpenter, or someone performing an ordinary task after an extraordinary voyage. Science recovered the year, but not the name. That anonymous axe stroke may be the perfect symbol for the real history behind Vinland Saga. The great narrative gives us Thorfinn and Leif. The object gives us a human action. Somewhere on a Newfoundland tree, a metal blade landed, chips fell. A person continued working. More than 1,000 years later, the rings inside that wood confirmed that the ocean had been crossed. So how historically accurate is Vinland Saga? If accuracy means that every character performed every action exactly as shown, it is highly fictional. Its protagonist's childhood, his father, his revenge, his slavery, his philosophy, and most of his companions were invented. The deaths and meetings of kings were rearranged. Warriors possess impossible physical abilities. If accuracy means reproducing the major events of the age, it is much closer. Danish armies attacked England. Thorkell changed sides. Sweyn briefly conquered the kingdom. Canute returned and became king. Norse Greenlanders sailed to North America. Karlsefni and Gudrid were remembered as leaders of a settlement attempt. Contact and conflict contributed to withdrawal. If accuracy means understanding what history felt like, the series may be strongest of all. Wealth and violence reinforce one another. Slavery hides beneath prosperous households. Religion offers compassion and legitimacy at the same time. Fame preserves warriors while victims disappear. A farm can be another battlefield, and a king's peace can be maintained by fear. The fictional material does not merely decorate the record, it asks the questions the record cannot answer. What did a child learn from constant war? Could a killer truly change? What did peace mean to a person who owned nothing? What responsibility did settlers have toward those already living on the land? At what point does defense become the beginning of conquest? We cannot ask the historical Karlsefni these questions. We have no private confession from Gudrid, no final reflection from Thorkell, and no honest diary from Canute. Fiction gives them interior lives, then allows the audience to test those lives against evidence. The result is not the real past restored perfectly. No story can do that. It is a bridge between the fragmentary world historians can document and the human world imagination tries to recover. At one end of that bridge stand turf walls in Newfoundland, silver coins stamped for a Danish king of England, runestones raised for men who traveled overseas, and manuscripts preserving family names. At the other stand Thor's on a ship, Askeladd beneath a falling crown, Einar in a field, Canute before the sea, and Thorfinn looking west. Some of those images never happened. The world that made them possible did. And that may be the final reason Vinland Saga's version of history remains so convincing. It knows that history is not made real by filling a story with dates. It becomes real when choices have costs, when power has limits, and when even the strongest person cannot escape the consequences carried forward by others. The real Thorfinn Karlsefni did not conquer North America. He arrived, stayed for a time, and left. His buildings vanished beneath the earth. His voyage survived as family memory, then saga, then argument, and finally archaeology. The fictional Thorfinn travels toward the same coast carrying a burden history never assigned him. He wants to create a place without war or slavery. The audience already knows that the settlement will not endure, but that knowledge does not make the attempt meaningless. It makes every peaceful choice more difficult and more valuable. More than 500 years before Columbus, Norse sailors reached North America. In 1021, at least one of them cut wood at the northern edge of Newfoundland with a metal blade. That much is certain. The names of everyone who stood nearby are lost. The exact route is uncertain. The conversations are gone. But the crossing was real. Karlsefni's expedition was remembered, and a temporary camp proved that the horizon beyond Greenland led to another inhabited world. Vinland Saga takes those fragments and asks what kind of person should cross that horizon. A conqueror, a merchant, a refugee, or someone searching for a country that does not yet exist. History cannot tell us that Thorfinn found peace. It can tell us something quieter. He went west. He returned alive. And for one brief moment, 1,000 years ago, the distance between saga and reality became no wider than the ring of an ancient tree.